Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we discuss the Gilded Age, which is episode 3 of our second unit on the empire business. The Gilded Age was this period where local and national political corruption seemed to call for reform efforts in the 19th century. So, dear, listen to our stories, that you might find your place among his delight. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 10, describe the political corruption of the Gilded Age. 11, explain the measures taken by Gilded Age presidents to reform the spoils system. And 12, to differentiate approaches to tariff reform at the end of the 1800s. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 10. The years after Reconstruction, more or less of about 1870 to the period of 1900 at the turn of the century, so that more or less of 30 years, came to be known as the Gilded Age. Gilding is an artistic technique where a very thin layer of gold is applied over something otherwise inconsequential, wood or plaster, and it gives this sheen of luster and wealth, but really scratch the surface and there's not much holding it up. That term was coined by Mark Twain to describe an era that seemed to be rich and prosperous, but it was concealing a weak underpinning and real moral decay. A great example of this is in our subpoint B, that of the political machines. Political machines were these organized groups that controlled a city's political party. More or less every significant city had a political machine that used its political power to give services to voters and to businesses in exchange for the political votes and financial supports that would go on and sustain the machine. In the years after the Civil War, political machines gained control over the life of cities. Almost every city had more or one machine governing its urban civic life. They had these complex organizations with precinct captains and ward bosses and ultimately a city boss. While certainly corrupt, and I don't think there's any question over the corruption of a political machine, they also fulfilled an important role for cities. And they provided help for families in poverty, they helped immigrants find a sense of community, and to provide legal and illegal help for advantage. It was all headed by a city boss. And whether or not the boss served as mayor, and it's always a he controlled access to city jobs and to business licenses. The influenced courts and city agencies. He arranged building projects and community services. The bosses received kickbacks from businesses. They were paid off by businesses. They earned voter loyalty and extended their influence over a variety of things. More or less anything that you needed to handle government went through a city boss's hands. The captains and other bosses, they were often first or second generation immigrants, and they would then turn around and help immigrants with things like getting citizenship naturalization or jobs or housing. They used electoral fraud to win elections, and here's one of the real problems with political machines. It used graft. Now, graft is the illegal use of political influence for personal gain, and it was the main tool of government corruption. Machines took kickbacks and bribes to allow legal and illegal activities. A great example of this, the most famous example, was that of Boss Tweed. The Tweed ring scandal was centered around William Tweed. They called him Boss Tweed, and in 1868, he headed Tammany Hall in New York City. Tammany Hall was essentially like the immigrant wing of the Democratic Party in New York. And the Tweed ring was used to defraud the city of millions of dollars over several years. He was brought to national attention through a cartoonist named Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast, a famous political cartoonist of the day, would illustrate the outrageous things that Tweed would be using and prompted the ensuing public outrage that led the Tweed ring to be broken up in 1871. Roman numeral number 11. We need to discuss a term known as patronage. Patronage has a couple of names, but political scientists generally use the term patronage. It's the term used for giving government jobs to people who helped a candidate get elected. Just about all civil service jobs of the government administration were patronage jobs. Essentially, if you worked for the government, you got your job because some politician just hired you, whether or not of your qualifications for it. And so if you help the candidate get elected, the candidate wins office, and then the candidate turns around and rewards your loyalty with a job back in the government. The result of this became known as the spoils system. Like to the victor goes the spoils. It's the second term for the patronage system, is the spoils system. It is that some appointees were really not qualified for their work, and some used their position for personal gain. Reformers then pushed for a different kind of a model known as the merit system, and the merit system would go and hire civil service reform, that a person would earn their job not because they were a loyal political lackey, but had actual merit and credentials to go fulfill the position. When Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president in 1876, he tried to end the patronage system in federal government. Hayes was a reformer, but he was a reformer with a system that was really hard to fix. He appointed independent people to his cabinet, not like political lackeys, and he created a commission to go investigate specific federal corruption. The commission investigations led to 2 important firings of government officials, but that angered this rival group known as the Stalwarts. The Stalwarts liked the patronage system. They thought it was, while it wasn't a perfect system, it was a pretty good system. It shouldn't be abandoned. The Stalwarts were members of the Republican Party who opposed reforming the political system, and Hayes began to work his way through the outsides of the political machinations of the Republican Party. In 1880, Republican independent James Garfield won election. James Garfield's political career was heavily intertwined with the spoils system. He had it all over him. He almost really saw his political career cut short by the Credit Mobilier affair. That was a scheme that implicated Grant's, like Ulysses Grant, President Grant, his vice president and several members of Congress were caught up in this railroad scheme that Garfield carried that taint with him. People who wanted to maintain that patronage system, that spoils system in politics, they were known as the Stalwarts, a name that suggests keeping things the way they are. Reformers, on the other hand, were insultingly called half-breeds. Half-breeds were moderate Republicans who wanted to end patronage. By the 1880 election, Garfield's experience with the Credit Mobilier scandal had shifted him into the reformer camp. Still, though, he appointed several positions in the government through that old traditional patronage system. It was a hard system to shake. Garfield's vice president was a man named Chester A. Arthur, who has my favorite facial hair in presidential history. Chester A. Arthur was a stalwart compromise pick in the Republican Party. So on one side you have Garfield, who's a reformer. Essentially he's a half-breed. His vice president, Chester A. Arthur, is a stalwart. He likes the old patronage system. And it was a political marriage that put the president and the vice president on that ticket. At some point before the 1880 campaign, a man named Charles Guiteau wrote this pamphlet. Pamphleteering was a dominant way of political discourse at the time. And at some point, just before that 1880 campaign, Charles Guiteau wrote this rambling, incoherent speech in support of Ulysses S. Grant. When the Republicans nominated Garfield instead of Grant, Guiteau just took that same speech and changed all of the Grants to Garfields and printed it as a campaign flyer. It was kind of an awkward reworking. When Garfield and Arthur won office, Guiteau expected to be rewarded for his pamphleteering. In fact, he expected to be named ambassador to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Although he did inform the State Department that he would settle for, France as his second choice. When Guiteau went as far as badgering the Garfield administration for work, he was told that basically, we don't know who you are, your pamphlet didn't matter, you're not a member of our circle, and you should go away and never come back again. Guiteau's rejection triggered the inner demons of his already deluded psyche, and he plotted, this is crazy, he plotted Garfield's assassination. He openly intimated his intentions to the president. He would write threatening letters to the Secretary of State. He stalked the president's movements around Washington, even giving up one of his strikes on killing him because he didn't want Mrs. Garfield to witness her husband's death. This is not a man well grounded in reality. Guiteau also attempted to visit the jail that he would be put in after he was arrested, so that he could see the cell, see the future that awaits him. He even chose his murder weapon, in particularly a real pretty revolver, believing that it would look great in a museum one day. So on July 2nd of 1881, Guiteau saw Garfield boarding a train. Guiteau just casually approached on the station platform, drew his pistol, and shot Garfield from behind at a point-blank range. In a determined calm, Guiteau then marched to the exit of the station, where a nearby police officer grabbed him and apprehended him. Turning to the confused and horrified crowd who'd just witnessed an assassination, Guiteau shouted his purpose. He said, "I am the stalwart of stalwarts, and now Arthur is the president." He expected the stalwart wing of the Republican Party to welcome him as a hero. He even wrote a letter to General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the heroes of the Civil War, asking him to order your troops right away to spring me out of jail, believing that, Sherman would lead a military insurrection to oust an assassin. That didn't happen. You know what else didn't happen is that Garfield didn't immediately die. With modern medicine, Garfield might have even survived. His condition, though, was complicated by doctors who, with unsterilized tools and unsterilized fingers, kept poking around Garfield's body in an effort to go find the bullet. Inventor Alexander Graham Bell, he of telephone fame, invented a metal detector to go try to find the bullet, but it didn't occur to anyone that Garfield was laying on a bed with metal springs on it and the device never could locate the bullet. It was an emerging technology. Garfield lingered in pain for 80 more days, eventually dying not of the wound itself, but of blood poisoning and infection brought on by the doctors in an effort to try to go heal the wound. Subpoint E, although Chester A. Arthur had been a stalwart, being raised to the presidency by a madman meant that Arthur had to give up his advocacy of the patronage spoil system. He reacted to Guiteau's actions in basically the only way he could. He totally repudiated the patronage system and then embraced his predecessor's reformer agenda. The half-breed Republicans and the anti-patronage Democrats, they passed, with Arthur's help, the Pendleton Civil Service Act Reform Act of 1883. The Pendleton Act imposed restrictions on party influence through appointments. It set up a structure for government positions that were all contingent on a merit-based civil service exam that exists in a large part today in several corners of the federal government. Roman numeral number 12. Business buys influence, or Harrison, Cleveland, and high tariffs. Subpoint A. In 1884, Democrat Grover Cleveland won office. And when he won office, he promised to lower trade tariffs. But he didn't have the political support that he needed to go past those lower tariffs. And ultimately, Cleveland was seen as a failure at his main promise. In 1888, Cleveland won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College. And so he went back to practicing law, hoping that in 1892 he'd go win office again. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison won the presidency instead of Cleveland. And Benjamin Harrison supported higher tariffs to go protect American industry. You'll remember, of course, that tariffs, while they are a tax on imports, their main job isn't to raise tax money. It's to go affect how trade works. Tariffs theoretically would go protect American jobs. If you're importing steel, placing a tariff on imported steel makes that cost more, and so steel purchasers then would say, well, American steel costs less. In reality, the economics is more complicated than that. It raises the prices for everyone because American businesses don't end up competing on an equal footing. They're able to raise their prices. And tariffs really do have a carryover problem in the economy, but in the initial set, they look plausible and were a very popular economic tool here at the time of the turn of the century, and a little before and a little after. So Benjamin Harrison hoped to support higher tariffs to go protect American industry. Much of Harrison's early time in office was sorting out political appointees. This was a pretty typical pattern for a president. You win office and just like all of the appointees have to go get figured out. And Harrison, while he supported the merit system rather than the spoils system, the merit system was a much slower process and really tied up his business for a while. With his leadership, though, the McKinley Tariff Act was passed. And economic problems and low tax revenues, though, dogged the Harrison administration, and he wasn't reelected in 1892. This reintroduces Grover Cleveland. Then in 1882, Cleveland was reelected. He's the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and he supported the bill that turned around and lowered Harrison's McKinley tariff. So you had Cleveland, who was not big on tariffs, and then he is voted out of office. And then you have Harrison comes in, Benjamin Harrison, and then he tries to raise tariffs. It doesn't work out very well. There's an economic downturn from it. They blame Harrison, so they re-elect Cleveland to office. So Cleveland appears in the presidential line twice, non-consecutively. And so Cleveland worked to get a tariff act passed in 1894, which would ultimately backfired. The bill was so loaded with all the special interest, pork barrel spending, that it barely made a dent in the existing tariff rates. It also included the first time ever peacetime income taxes, 2% on anybody earning incomes of over $4,000 a year. That caused more economic trouble to industry than it actually solved. So Cleveland, he pulled his support when Congress added a piece to the bill instituting a federal income tax, but that became law in 1894 without the president's signature. But basically his efforts to go reform tariffs created it, and in a lot of ways Cleveland was left holding the bag for an income tax that he didn't create or sign into law. So in 1896 we have a new election, and that's when William McKinley became president. William McKinley is the person that beat William Jennings Bryan, who we met earlier in this unit. William Jennings Bryan, he the advocate of bimetallism, lost that election, and William McKinley takes office. William McKinley, his economic plans were basically to go benefit business and industry from the top to go benefit the wealthy. With his support of a gold standard, so not bimetallism, that's William Jennings Bryan, but you have the support of the gold standard, that kept inflation low. That benefited industrialists and basically savers who had amassed wealth. He also supported tariffs, which would protect American industry. The William McKinley administration will have a whole bunch of different carryovers through the rest of this unit and especially in our next, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.